So you had the successful repeal of the Stamp Act. And after that, you see a few years of relative peace and calm, diminishing tensions between the colonies and Parliament. But of course, the empire itself still faced this condition of economic distress, and they needed to act upon it. And you see the new finance minister in charge, his name is Charles Townsend. And of course, he's tasked with the duty to try to raise some kind of revenue somehow. So his strategy, when it came particularly to the colonies in North America, he was fully aware of the controversy that surrounded the Stamp Act. So he kind of acted delicately, if you will. He knew he didn't want to cause this reaction of anger. So what he did is pass taxation that could be considered or were considered as external taxes. And he particularly levied these taxes upon um, English imports that were purchased traditionally by the colonists from England. Not necessarily luxurious goods, but everyday goods like paper, lead, glass, silk, mirrors, tea, and so on and so forth. And of course, Townsend's rationale was, well, the colonials have purchased this stuff for decades, and therefore we could still depend on them to purchase it, and we add that tax on there, and it's an external tax, so this should not arouse any controversy. So assumed Townsend. Okay, so as stated in the second bullet there, he considered it very important that his Townsend duties were indeed external taxes, right? But here's the thing: from the colonial perspective, though at first the reaction to the Townsend duties were relatively mild compared to, say, the Stamp Act, you see more and more resentment build up of this added tax. And you also see um, controversial reasons as to why these duties were being issued and targeted towards the colonists in particular. In today's parlance, we call this conspiracy theories. All right. And historians, writing in the 20th century and the 21st century, have remarked a lot about the the number of conspiracy theories that circulated through the colonies during the colonial crisis leading up to the revolution. These conspiracy theories were basically, conspiracies that supposedly explained why these taxes were being levied upon them all of a sudden when you consider, more than 150 years of basically hands-off approach. And indeed, several conspiracy theories arose in response to Townsend duties. All right. So, in other words, let's remember that Townsend did not expect any condemnation issuing from the colonials towards his plan or his act because they were all external taxation. And let's remember that the Stamp Act Congress did not mind external taxes, so they argued. Right? What was unacceptable to the Stamp Act Congress were direct taxes or internal taxes. Townsend duties were all external taxes. That is to say, they're related to the transatlantic trade system. So, the colonial response, however, was not one of passive, resignation or acceptance of these duties. Rather, eventually, it became very controversial. And again, this is aided by the fact that a lot of conspiracy theories circulated as to why Parliament was oppressing them with this tax. Okay, so in other words, why would the colonials respond in such a manner, right? When external taxes in principle were considered acceptable. Well, by this time, the colonials no longer thought that the distinction between external taxation and internal taxation was important. It no longer mattered in their minds. Okay, that was for the past, for the Stamp Act only, right? Now we see another act of attempted taxation, and in the colonial mindset, whether this was true or not, right? This was arguably a conspiracy. The mindset believed that Parliament was basically targeting unfairly the colonials in the task to, rescue the English treasury from their bankruptcy. And moreover, they felt that Townsend and his duties, they were there to control the consumption habits of the colonials, right? And let's remember that economic freedom was something that the colonials enjoyed practically since the beginning of settlement, right? Economic freedom, the right to consume, to use our key idea in this course, consumption, right? Consumerism. They consumed what they wanted, whether it was, French tea or English tea, right? Despite the Navigation Acts, despite mercantilism. All right, so again, the notion that England was trying to control their consumption habits circulated widely, added with the fact that they felt they were unfairly targeted. All right, so you see reaction eventually pick up, and this is especially due to this well-known political tract that was written by this important figure, and his name was John Dickinson. And he wrote this very important work called Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. Now, it should be mentioned that John Dickinson would become one of our important founding fathers by the time of the Revolution in 1775-76. But he's not just a regular farmer. He's actually wealthy. He's an elite person. Okay, I mean, he's a farm owner, but he's not a yeoman farmer, for example. Okay, now the basic idea that he is arguing in response to the Townsend duties, it actually follows a very sort of elegant, logical. It follows a very logical path. Okay, and this is how it evolved. He starts with premises, right? And by the way, this is the one before you in this slide is a different argument. What we're going to discuss here is the main argument, okay? And then we'll discuss the argument in the slide. The main thing he's arguing is this. The first premise he comes up with is we can't be truly happy if we're not free. In other words, happiness depends on our freedom. Number two, he says, well, we can't be free if we're not secure in our property. Okay? And then he moves on to the third premise. And we can't be secure in our property if it's taken away without our consent. Right? So the conclusion is, the Townsend duties are taking away our property without our consent. Therefore, we truly cannot be free and happy. All right, so that's the path, the trajectory of the argument here. Now, I included this argument before you, though, because I think it's interesting in how you could see how logic, even something that's elegant, to use my earlier term, and the way it's structured, right? It makes sense. Every premise, right, and the conclusion follows beautifully from the premises, right? Regardless of a perfectly structurally sound argument, there could still be flaws in it if we really use our critical thinking. And here's one that I'm presenting just to show how this could be the case. And this is if you will, a sub-argument nested in the political work, Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. So, like I said, it's sort of a secondary argument, aside from the first one I just mentioned. He says in here, premise one, if we're taxed without our consent, then it's a violation of our liberty. Okay, we could accept that perhaps, right? That is true. Well, he says, well, and if we have no liberty, if our liberty is violated, we are slaves, right? Is that acceptable? Well, if you really think what slavery is, or if you think in your mind what a slave is, it's someone who has no freedom, right? So if you make the claim, if we have no liberty, we are slaves, perhaps that makes sense or it's acceptable, right? So the conclusion he draws here is that if premise one is true and premise two is true, then the conclusion follows logically. That is to say, if we're taxed without our consent, we are slaves. Okay, so and he's making that argument, but when we really think about it, especially from our 21st century perspective, looking back, it's quite easy for us to criticize John Dickinson because we know who the real slaves are, quote unquote. Right? John Dickinson is a wealthy man in Pennsylvania. He's powerful. He's an elite. Yet he's claiming that due to Townsend duties, he's a slave as well as other colonials who are, if you will, suffering from this duty, right? But when we really think about slavery, the real slaves are those working in the plantations due to racialized slavery, as we know, right? Okay, so this is just a way we could look at Dickinson here to look at his argument and even other arguments that claim, something that may not be true, right? That they're being enslaved due to the Townsend duties. Now, with John Dickinson's political work gaining popularity, you see colonial populations, especially in the seaboard, right? These important cities that are ports for English goods. You see them act swiftly in the attempt to repudiate the Townsend duties, right? To somehow show their defiance. And there's two particular ways that they did this. Number one was to issue what you could call non-consumption agreements. And related to that was something called non-importation agreements. Okay, so what were these agreements or these acts? Well, the non-consumption agreement is exactly how it sounds. It basically is an agreement among colonials not to purchase English goods, right? Especially those goods that are part of Townsend's duties, glass, mirrors, silk, and all that stuff, right? Basically, the modern word for this is boycotting, right? Don't buy those English goods, and that way it will prevent Parliament from getting their money from us, our money, right, to enter the colonial mindset. Okay, and related to that was non importation. Basically, one way of enforcing non-importation was to literally prevent English ships carrying cargo, preventing them from docking on colonial ports, right? And by the way, if you dock as an English ship in a colonial port, you automatically um, get the taxation right before you return to England. After you, of course, um, let or let go of your cargo, right? Unload your cargo. All right, so prevent them from docking in the colonies, and we'll see. That's actually what was supposed to happen during what's called the Tea Party um, revolt. Okay, so non-importation and non-consumption. If you look at that poster here before you, it's an example of non-consumption. And what it's doing is calling out someone named William Jackson, who was an importer of English goods, right? And this thing even gives where Jackson is located, right? His store, the Brazen Head, north side of the townhouse, opposite the town pump in Cornhill, Boston. And what interests us, however, is The statement below it, it is desired that the sons and daughters of liberty would not buy one thing of him, that is Jackson, right? For in so doing, they will bring disgrace upon themselves and their posterity forever and ever. Amen. Okay, so this was common back then with the non consumption agreements. You see public shaming of those who decided not to participate, right? You see their names printed in the local newspaper. You see them subject to public humiliation, even tarring and feathering, right? If you don't know what that is, look that up. That's one way of public shaming someone back then, and so on and so forth. And interestingly enough, the non consumption agreements was one avenue that provided colonial women with the opportunity to participate in the political world, even though they're traditionally banished, as you well know, uh, as we discussed in a previous video. Well, during those times, women were often in charge of purchasing the particular household goods. So they went out to, the markets by the docks and they purchased English goods there. But now, what they did is boycott those goods, right? So it's interesting to note how this is actually quite modern, right? This idea of boycotting. Why? Because it's involved with consumerism, right? A very modern activity. In other words, it's interesting to note the connection here of how your act of not consuming particular goods can reflect a larger political philosophy, right? Somehow those two are connected, those two things, one abstract and the other very concrete and material, right? That's to say, consumption. Again, women were actually, um, if you will, given this opportunity to enter the public sphere, right? In a mild way, but still, um, at least it provided them with that opportunity. And one important event that happened was something called the Boston Massacre in 1770. During this time, you see the presence of English troops still hanging around in England, even though the 7 Years' War, had ended 7 years ago. In fact, you see the increasing presence of English troops because of the tension surrounding the Townshend duties. So it became a regular sight, for example, in some cities of patrolling English troops. Now, if you're a colonial, you really resented that. You saw them as a standing army in your presence. But nonetheless, you see these troops there patrolling the streets, and sometimes they were subject to harassment from the townspeople. And this is what happened in Boston. You see troops marching around, and they became subject to harassment from the colonials on one particular day. It intensified, it escalated. The colonials started throwing things at the troops, like clamshells and rocks and snowballs or what have you. And confusion abounded because of this. And one English troop, one soldier, actually fired. And this led to other English troops firing their muskets as well. And it led to the death of five Bostonians there. And by the way, the first person to ever die, who's considered the first martyr of the American Revolution, his name was Crispus Attucks. And he was actually an African American. So interesting to note that, how an African American person was the first person to die in the struggle for American Revolution. But nonetheless, you see this happening. It's put forth as a massacre, the Boston Massacre of 1770. And the English troops who are involved are actually brought to trial in Boston, not in England, but in Boston. And who represent them, the troops that is, in court? Someone named John Adams. John Adams, as you probably know, is an important founding father who would become actually our second president. He would be Washington's vice president and then succeed him after 2 terms of Washington. Okay, so John Adams actually represents in court. He acts as the defense attorney for these English troops who killed colonials. Now, what does that indicate to you? Well, it should be obvious that at this point, someone like John Adams, let alone other people like Dickinson and Benjamin Franklin and Washington and most other colonial leaders who would become the vanguard of leadership by 1776, as you know, were not yet exactly revolutionary. That is to say, there's no radical ideas that they held about, cutting the umbilical relation, if you will, with the mother country. They did not want separation yet. In fact, here is our important founding father defending the English colonials successfully, by the way, in court. All right, so this is another example of why you could argue the American Revolution was not exactly inevitable, as some people may may gather, right? Based on these revolutionary slogans like "Give me liberty" or "Give me death," right? That was not the sentiment. That's pure, if you will, rhetoric, right? It's rhetorical. Um, so another indication of why the revolution was not exactly um, foreordained, if you will.